Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Just want to do a different video kind of exploring the relationship between cyberpunk and fashion. And when I first set out to do this video, I kind of thought it would be pretty straightforward how a cyberpunk directly influences fashion. But as I researched more and, rewatched a lot of these iconic movies and just thought about it, I really kind of came to the conclusion that it's much more open-ended than that. But we're gonna go ahead and take a stab at it. So let's go for it. Clothing among literature and other artistic expressions is often a representation of the greater culture at hand. And I find that the cyberpunk genre has influenced our fashion today for sure. From small subcultures such as the techwear community to the general fashion consumer. However, I do not believe it is only the very visually appealing aspect that people draw inspiration from. I kind of find that the deeper themes of the cyberpunk genre are resonating with people now more so than in recent years. And again, when I embarked on creating this video, I just realized how broad this topic is and how open it is for interpretation. So this video reflects my subjective perspective on the many meanings of the themes in the cyberpunk genre, and therefore how those themes influence character designs and consequently the fashion of our world. So this video is me defining significant themes and aesthetics in cyberpunk and showcasing examples of fashion and clothing that echo these aesthetics and themes and just how this relationship has come about. I may recognize cyberpunk's influence on fashion in some places overlooked by some and vice versa. I may be completely oblivious to a clear-cut example of fashion that pulls from the genre, and simply in the interest of time, I can't name every single fashion show or brand that draws inspiration from it. But what I do know is that my personal style does draw significant influence from cyberpunk, and the clothes I wear on a daily basis would not be what they are if it was not for this genre of literature and film. Fashion has historically always reflected the general society as a whole, and looking back during the French Revolution, it became unstylish to wear the attire of the wealthy and the ruling class. I mean, people were getting guillotined fairly regularly, so I can see how it might not be the best time to wear those garments, but I digress. Clarissa Esguerra, which I probably butchered that name, who is the assistant curator of costume and textiles at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, wrote a very nice brief article titled French Revolutionary Fashion, showcasing how the changing political environment forever changed menswear. Quote, "When the French Revolution finally drew to a close in 1799, menswear was changed forever. Wool and cotton were favored over silks, somber colors were preferred over previously popular powder blues, pinks, and greens, and the tailcoat and pantaloons would become the new uniform for the 19th century man." End quote. This is just one example on how changing fashion often reflects a changing society. Another pretty clear-cut example of the relationship between fashion and greater culture at large was in the 1960s with the hippie movement. Often seen as a rejection of many establishment culture norms, kind of liberalism was a core theme during this time. Hippie attire was a visual indicator that reflected many of the contemporary debates surrounding freedom of drug use, openness about sex, and being anti-war. The point I'm trying to nail home here is that fashion is often a visual manifestation of the cultural norms and values and or societal fears. So when it comes to cyberpunk's influence on fashion, I think there is an overarching effect on broad consumers who pick up on general aspects such as dressing with more military-inspired garments and more technical clothing. And then there are those specific subcultures, such as the techwear community mentioned before, who draw direct influence from the source material, i.e. both Blade Runner movies, The Matrix, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, etc. So what even is cyberpunk? I've been talking for the past 5 minutes about it, but haven't defined it yet. And it's a term that can often get thrown around loosely, even by myself. to describe something that seems just generally futuristic. However, the term cyberpunk refers to a genre of literature focusing within the science fiction space, usually set in like a lawless subculture of an oppressive society dominated by computer technology, and which is much more complicated, more mouthful than just like, oh, saying it's futuristic. But the genre has also been described as stories revolving around the relationship between humanity and technology, specifically the overextending entanglement of technology within human lives. And so a lot of these stories are based in worlds with a dehumanized population which can amplify these conflicts. And a common main theme surrounds the loss of humanity due to this advanced technology. This video is not wholly to convince you that we are living in some cyberpunk dystopia, because I mean that could be a whole video on its own, and it's honestly kind of up for debate, depending who you ask. But I think there is some decent evidence to suggest that we are, or at least that we have some concerning aspects of the genre that seem to be manifesting in our world. And I can imagine these authors back in the day saw where advancing technology could cause issues in the future, and therefore they wrote fiction surrounding those ideas. But anyways, I think it's important to contextualize this topic of cyberpunk's influence on fashion and cover some of the broad characteristics of reality that overlap with the themes of cyberpunk, because I think that affects people's willingness and want to dress in a certain way. For example, if someone talked about a new anime coming out with basic themes and plot points of mass surveillance from an increasingly authoritarian government, increased technology of human cybernetics from brain chips to limb prosthetics, a changing climate, increased pollution, intruding and unrelenting advertisements, widening wealth gap, increasing corporate power, hyper-consumerism, digital relationships sometimes being preferred over real ones, AI becoming more powerful and more prevalent, etc. Even with these themes alone, it could be easily classified in the cyberpunk genre, but especially if this story is dressed in the common aesthetics of cyberpunk. There's a wide variety of aesthetics within the cyberpunk space, but generally a common thread between them is the idea of high-tech, low-life, which is a frequently cited definition of the aesthetic. Like pretty much almost any article talking about the genre will use this definition, but I do think it does a good job of cutting straight to the point of what it is. Quite obviously, the cyber refers to the high advancements of technology, whereas the punk refers to the gritty, anti-establishment, or anti-authoritarian aspect of the genre. And both of these traits play into what we call cyberpunk fashion. But given the punk aspect, many stories revolve around the idea of kind of raging against the machine, and some iconic stories have ideas surrounding hackers and or rebellion. And because of this, common conflicts in these narratives focus on man versus technology, man versus society, but also as a consequence of these other conflicts, man versus self. Clothing is often directly correlated with our environment. Cyberpunk settings embody many of the anxiety-inducing themes of monopolized corporate power, as iconically seen in both Blade Runner films, or losing one's individuality or ability for human connection. The chaotic designs of many cyberpunk cityscapes can reflect the complexity and blurred moral lines of the characters, almost as if the world has become so much more complicated, humans cannot properly adapt in time. These worlds seem overwhelming, and I think often by design. In some stories, high-tech neon lights and giant advertisements can offer a bright, happy facade away from the often very bleak, unclean reality, whereas in others, the neon glow can often just represent just cool modern designs to incite interest in exploring this world and really nothing more. But this contrast between a futuristic, clean, high-tech world and the rundown grit of reality carries over to the characters' clothing, and therefore cyberpunk's influence on fashion. Since there is a wide diversity of cyberpunk stories, there is not a single clear clothing style or costume design. However, a common thread between almost all these clothing designs is that they all seem to be, futuristic, which I know calling cyberpunk fashion as high-tech is very apparent, But whether it be formal attire worn by mega corporate entities or by soldiers and people with boots on the ground, most of the designs have a new take on clothing and outfits. Because of this common rebellious and punk underground culture within these stories, one can make a connection between the characters dressing opposite of their ruling class. And because of their social status, it makes sense why these characters often wear more practical clothing of the working class, in contrast with the luxury and impracticality of fancier attire. And due to the frequent conflicts in these stories, many characters have to be physically active, fighting or fleeing. And clothing that offers functionality is common in cyberpunk character designs, and often is carried over to those who draw inspiration from these stories and themes. Clothing items such as cargo pants, bodysuits, rider jackets, and military garments can be associated with this genre. Ghost in the Shell, both the anime and live action, I think really nail the take on military clothing in a future dystopian world. Which does make sense since the main characters are in Section 9, which is basically a security team for the state's intelligence department. But anyways, I think it looks really good, and Ghost in the Shell, they just really nail that. Due to the common cyberpunk aesthetic of grittiness, the worlds are often depicted with unpleasant weather and pollution, causing a need for characters to wear technical clothing such as long raincoats and or jackets with additional protection of the neck and face. Events such as ecological collapse or a nuclear winter would most definitely give cause for many of the hostile environmental conditions. And by the way, this is supposed to be Southern California, and it's snowing there quite a bit, which kind of leads me to believe that there is some nuclear event that happened which cooled the earth. But anyways, the aftermath of catastrophic events would affect the world in dramatic ways, and I think that would be reflected in clothing as well. Aesthetics that embody heavy amounts of layering, function over form, heavy distressing from fading and ripped garments, and when the idea of kind of caring about fashion rules is just thrown out the window, it really leads to a dystopian look. Also, as a side note, face masks are a common occurrence not just due to the prevalent pollution, but also if there's like an authoritarian force with high technology, there may be a focus on kind of laying low given facial recognition technology. Connecting this to our world, being honest, there's a lot of reality which is dirty and unpleasant. Even though we are more technologically advanced than ever, that technology can't help everyone and it can be used against us. I think this is a core reason why people are drawn to the genre and why some fashion designers have picked up on these themes, and it can be reflected in their clothes. Generally speaking, half of the equation that makes up the genre of cyberpunk is technology, and technology is commonly referred to in terms of computers, such as the new release of an iPhone, the invention of blind spot assist on cars, and more advanced graphic cards and all that. However, the definition of technology is, quote, the science of the application of knowledge to practical purposes, end quote. Meaning that the advancements of all things from material goods to online programs is classified as technology. That being said, fabric and clothing technology is a very real thing. Over the years, the advancements in materials have spearheaded clothing forward beyond the typical cyclical nature of fashion. XEONIQ, creator of Shell Zine, wrote an insightful article titled The Mainstreaming of Techwear, which highlights the often overlooked technological progression of clothing. For those tuning in who are not familiar with the term techwear, it's generally referred to as a niche style community focusing on technical garments, both the fabric science as well as the ergonomic cut and design of the clothing. But anyways, even if someone is completely oblivious to this fashion niche, it's almost a guarantee that they have some modern technical clothing in their wardrobe. XEONIQ writes, consumers demand comfort, versatility, and practicality. Techwear at a mainstream level is represented by brands such as Uniqlo, Lululemon, and activewear giants like Nike have understood and delivered on these needs. Thus, these companies continue to grow. Techwear has been mainstreamed and for the meticulous consumers whose interests lie in garment performance, value, and achieving a synergy between their lifestyles and the clothes they wear, there has never been more availability of products to cater to their needs. End quote. Earlier on in the article, he kind of contextualizes how the global fashion industry has gotten to this point, highlighting contributing factors such as laxer social norms regarding dress codes to demands by consumers for more convenience with their clothing. For example, the development of anti-wrinkle fabrics, which it's not just for lazy people. If you ever get an anti-wrinkle shirt, it's actually really nice because it looks better throughout the whole day too. But anyways, it's natural for humans to continuously progress clothing. I mean, long time ago, humans dressed in furs and skins, and then progressed to spinning wools and cottons, and at some branch of this fashion evolution, we got this, which cybergoth actually has ties to cyberpunk, but again, that would be for another video. And I'm trying to stick to a broad level, top level coverage here on the subject. If the topic of cyberpunk and technical fashion appeals to you, I highly recommend you check out Shell Zine. He's published some really good articles that can act as guides to the genre. So if you're looking for a source that lists some good cyberpunk movies, animes, or even video games, I recommend starting there. I'm subscribed to their newsletter, so I get updates when a new article is published, but I also follow XEONIQ on Instagram as he's one of my style influences. In his most recent article, he explores this topic of cyberpunk's influence on fashion, and in it he created a model for people to have a guide to dressing in like a cyberpunk way. So very nice article. I really respect his expertise on the subject, but I'm going to come back to this article later on in this video. Fabric technology has come a long way. Gore-Tex is a very well-known performance fabric, and it manages to be waterproof, windproof, and yet still breathable. Another breakthrough in fabric technology was the mass-adopted stretch materials, from four-way stretch cargo pants to chinos. Even suits and business attire is opening up to the world of technical fabrics. So when I look at cyberpunk clothes, and it takes place in the future, 2049, 2077, just think about how far fabric technology has gone to that point. And that's why I think clothing technology plays a crucial role in what we call cyberpunk fashion. But there is not only a technological aspect propelling cyberpunk fashion, which I think is a natural progression of humans and how we evolve, but I think there's also a societal and aesthetic one as well. And punk clothing aesthetics are one of the roots that build up to make cyberpunk fashion. Pinpointing the social influence on dystopian aesthetics and fashion is tricky, and again, this is open to interpretation, which is kind of what made it difficult. But in my opinion, I think that people resonate with the themes of the cyberpunk genre in a growing amount in reference to the last couple of decades, I would say. Also, there's been an increased affinity towards breaking fashion rules or norms. I mean, just look at what high fashion brands are doing today. And in combination with ever-expanding technology, I can see how there's a growing interest and attraction to cyberpunk aesthetics and fashion. A research paper titled "A Study of Fashion Influenced by Dystopian Ideas" I found to be very well written and relevant to this subject. Published through the Journal of the Korean Society of Clothing and Textiles, the authors Sang-hee Kwon and Ji So-ha, I'm definitely butchered those names, they explore the chain reaction from the external environment to dystopian fashion. Now, this article was written in Korean. I found a tool on Google Translate that will convert a whole PDF to English, so I hope the translation is accurate. But what I find fascinating about this article is that it tackled this topic from a sociological standpoint. And keep in mind, this was published in 2013, and they cite some good examples of real-world dystopian-inspired fashion, and I recommend checking out the article to see for yourself. But since the great year of 2013, I think since then there's been some really nice examples of designers and brands that produce, cyberpunk and dystopian clothes. Within the article, there's a table to visualize the relationship from external societal fears that influences clothing designers. And as you can see, the authors break down three main eras from the 20th and beginning of 21st century, and the corresponding societal concerns and their respective effect on fashion. Now, they attribute the catalyst of this chain reaction surrounding the concept of defamiliarization, which is an artistic technique of presenting audiences common things in a unique or strange way so that they can gain a new perspective on the subject. So basically, fashion designers are taking clothes, which is something that we're all familiar with, and redesigning them to provide a new perspective on what clothing means or what it could be. Or at least that's the way I interpret it. So looking at this table here, kind of what stands out to me is the purple boxes down here. That itself is the process of defamiliarization. So designers are expressing contemporary fears of society, whether it be, human control by monopoly power and technology, or, ecological disaster. And then they're providing a critical view on the subject through redesigning clothing in a new way. And the goal of this is to seek problem-solving actions and alternatives to change or cope with the situation. And I think it's a pretty accurate reason on why people are dressing in a more dystopian way nowadays. Something I want to point out is in the section that's the 1980s and 1990s, the fear was human control by monopoly power, and then fashion that expressed dehumanization by high-tech means was kind of like the catalyst to affect fashion, which led to kind of cyberpunk style. And this include clothing designs that kind of incorporate electronic elements, so even in the new Cyberpunk 2077 game, like the jacket has like the light up, thing, or in the original Blade Runner, the light up umbrellas. And then looking at post 2000s, this is really interesting. It's a much bigger focus on ecological disaster caused by pollution, resource depletion, or nuclear catastrophe. And we can see this in Blade Runner 2049, which came out, obviously in 2017. And so you can see how the societal fears have been separated through the years. Just looking at the types of fashion in the post-2000s, the thing that stood out to me was the protective designs that use high-tech fabrics or mechanical devices. So that, in combination with the previous generation of cyberpunk style, I think that really kind of nails home what kind of cyberpunk fashion is to me. Given how many designers and brands are available to consumers nowadays, there are so many examples that people can select from that may indeed pull inspiration from cyberpunk. But I'm going to go over some specific brands and designers that I find have incorporated at least some of the aesthetics of cyberpunk into their clothes. However, I always like it when a brand goes beyond just drawing upon the aesthetic, but it has ties to the deeper themes of the genre. And by no means am I implying that any of these designers pull directly from cyberpunk media. Rather, it could be indirect or unintended inspiration, or similarities. But here are several brands and designers that I do think pull inspiration from cyberpunk. By far the largest brand that I'm going to mention is Yeezy, and Kanye doesn't have the most technically advanced fabrics or super ergonomic cuts to the clothes, but I think there are some decent elements to his clothes that overlap with the cyberpunk genre. A main characteristic I see between Yeezy and cyberpunk is the dystopian design. Yeezy Season 2, released in September of 2015, stands out to me as the most overwhelmingly dystopian. Garments are heavily faded, all with washes with hues of sand and other minerals. The styling of these pieces invokes almost a very disheveled look, and this is amplified by the use of kind of worn-in military-inspired garments such as desert combat boots or bomber jackets. With the implementation of workwear, in nowhere are these pieces supposed to look like they should be luxurious, and I can easily picture these clothes being set in a cyberpunk dystopia similar to the orphanage in Blade Runner 2049. Kanye himself has stated on several occasions that he has been heavily inspired by the 1988 film Akira. In a Forbes video, Kanye West and the creative process behind his Adidas Yeezy shoes, Kanye was asked his process on designing his large inventory of sneakers and boot designs. He highlighted a contributing influence was, quote, feelings of film and experiences I grew up with. Akira, the movie Akira, my mom took me to go see when I was really young, and the shapes and the color palettes and the general mood of the film has always been a big inspiration for Yeezy, end quote. Now, Akira is not a super dirty or grungy dystopia like other cyberpunk works, but the general themes and mood of Akira, a cyberpunk film, has been a huge influence on all things Yeezy. And Yeezy has gone on to influence fashion in huge ways and has gotten so many people into fashion, including myself to a certain extent. Season 2, having those elements of heavy distressing and weathering in combination with functional attire such as workwear and military garments really gives me the impression that the genre of cyberpunk has made its way into the design process. Moving on to another brand, I could not make this video without mentioning Acronym. This German-based brand fuses style and technical clothing in a very unique way. And that's one of the many reasons why it's a favorite clothing brand of mine. Pretty much every piece of clothing that gets designed looks like it's straight out of some high-tech dystopian cityscape. But even then, Acronym will sometimes take inspiration from military garments and improve upon them and reinvigorate them with new clothing technology. The designer Erlson Hugh got his start in the fashion industry by designing a snowboarding jacket for Burton. In an interview, Hugh stated what drew him to designing this jacket was the combination of technical clothing and the punk/underground culture of snowboarding. But I think this was a good foundation of a combination between technical clothing and kind of a punk style, which kind of went on to kind of echo a lot of cyberpunk's clothes where there's a technical and punk kind of combination. But if anyone were to ask me what futuristic fashion looks like, I would cite Acronym as one of the top brands exploring that style. Even William Gibson, who is often credited as the forefather of the cyberpunk genre through such novels such as Neuromancer, which went on to inspire such films like The Matrix, even he gets completely dripped out in full Acronym and is like a huge fan of the brand. And so that to me is a pretty strong sign that Acronym makes some pretty nice, cyberpunk clothes. Rosenex is a brand with made-to-order technical garments, and while being much more affordable than Acronym, they still have a lot of pieces that seem to echo a lot of the common clothing items worn by cyberpunk characters. And it's one of those brands that goes above and beyond just pulling from cyberpunk aesthetic, but they design clothes to be functional and wearable for every day. Multiple pieces draw inspiration from cyberpunk. One of the items that stands out most to me is the Triton trench coat. It's very, very Blade Runner-ish, if you ask me, and I think it looks absolutely amazing. I have a couple overshirts from them, and I really like the kind of Matrix vibe it gives off. And it's definitely one of those brands that cohesively and consistently creates, cyberpunk clothes. Another made-to-order technical brand is Enfant-Levy, and this one has much more of a darker, kind of edgier look to it, and perhaps leans more on the science fiction / otherworldly vibe to it. But I think the core themes of cyberpunk clothes can still be found here as well. It's pretty easy for me to picture these clothes in sci-fi works such as Dune, Star Wars, or Star Trek. A combination of dystopian or otherworldly designs mixed with these technical and crazy fabrics really lends itself to the genre. Even though they have some pretty outlandish designs, probably some of my most worn pairs of pants are the Amestu articulated technical pants. I wear those things all the time. If you want to go all out dystopian science fiction, look no further than Hamka's. Just scrolling through their site really gives the impression that these clothes take inspiration from some dystopian rugged future. Almost all these clothes are faded with crazy amounts of layering and really unique silhouettes. I could go on and on about brands or designers that pull from cyberpunk, but those are just 5 kind of off the top of my head that seem to pull inspiration from the genre. But speaking in context of my personal style, I can't overanalyze why I may or may not be attracted to wear a certain style. But I do think a significant part of my style is inspired by cyberpunk and other science fiction works. Hell, even growing up with Star Wars, I think rubbed off on me a little bit with its somewhat futuristic yet gritty feel. And by no means am I saying that Star Wars is cyberpunk, because it just simply isn't. Star Wars is a space opera, but I think sometimes there can be overlapping similar aesthetic choices between the two stories, but really that's about it. At the end of the day, I like the clothes because I think they just look cool and I feel comfortable in them. I mean, both physically and psychologically. Something about how cyberpunk fashion looks somewhat edgy yet practical is really appealing to me. And earlier I mentioned how heavy distressing and fading is an aspect of dystopian fashion. Well, I mean, my personal style doesn't draw that much inspiration from those elements. I usually try and stick to kind of all black and neutrals and much cleaner, wearable silhouettes. But I think techwear and cyberpunk fashion shows what clothing could be rather than what clothing was/is. And pretty much anyone can predict what's going to be trendy in a couple years. Just look at what's trending now. Let's say it's like early 2000s. Well, in a couple years, probably fashion from 2006, 2007, 2008 is going to be trendy, you know? And I just think that techwear and technical fashion is kind of spearheading fashion forward beyond that kind of cycle there. But just talking through some of my favorite clothing items that can be classified as cyberpunk clothes, especially when styled properly, are things such as ergonomic functional pants. Cargo pants have become an absolute staple in my wardrobe. You know, it's actually really nice to have those extra pockets. Usually they're very ergonomic, they move well with your body, and I like the aesthetic of them as well. Moving on to footwear, over time I've kind of moved past wearing so many sneakers and I've gravitated towards wearing boots, although I like boots that combine the best of sneakers and boots, you know, something kind of like a sneaker boot, which is a super clever name, I know. But it's nice to have a wearable, utilitarian, and I think very stylish selection of footwear. You know, comfortable boots that offer nice functional features but are better suited towards like urban wear. Even wearing performance-based t-shirts on a regular basis have made it where I kind of don't want to go back to standard t-shirts. And you know, once you start going down this technical clothing path, it's like so nice just to have clothing that works so well with your body and works well with, you know, the weather conditions you're in. Obviously, a huge cyberpunk clothing staple are raincoats and waterproof fabrics. Incredibly cool. I wish it rained more where I live, but you know, things like trench coats or shell jackets I think really are a good representation of technical clothing. Another kind of cyberpunk clothing staple is military garments, you know, things like bomber or tanker jackets, even like cargo pants like I mentioned earlier. But the thing with military garments is that usually they're made really well and they're made to last, but also they're very functional as well, and they come in usually just really nice kind of earth tones to it. But in terms of accessories, I think any futuristic accessories can go a long way to make an outfit look more, you know, cyberpunk. Some of my favorite bags are from Orbit Gear, and they make technical messenger bags. But just speaking towards the general aesthetic of cyberpunk clothes, I just like how wearable and subtle a lot of these clothes are, yet I think they stand out a bit. Cyberpunk characters are often physically on the move. Therefore, frivolous clothing is not ideal for these situations. Functional and practical clothing works much better. Given the densely populated cityscapes and rebellious nature of these stories, sometimes characters need to act from concealment and, you know, blend into the masses. So sometimes clothing needs to be pretty subtle. But in today's world, comfort, convenience, and functionality is a top priority of consumers' demands for clothing, and this often echoes the needs and wants of our favorite cyberpunk characters. Dystopian aesthetics are becoming more and more common because of our contemporary societal fears regarding aspects such as the overextending influence technology has in our lives, as well as increased corporate power and or, you know, ecological concerns. Perhaps because our world is becoming more and more similar to a cyberpunk dystopia, people are resonating with these cyberpunk characters more. Maybe I'm overthinking this and the clothes just look really cool. But we are seeing the breakdown of many fashion norms, which can lead people to wearing more unique styles. And as dress codes become more lax, this allows people to find clothes that work with their lifestyles and allow them to explore a wider range of styles and pull inspiration from all aspects of life, including cyberpunk media. But I think there is something to be said regarding the increasing technology in our world and how that should and does correlate with clothing technology. And I'm looking forward to the upcoming fabric and clothing technology developments in the years to come, and I can't wait to be some old man dripped out in some like futuristic fit. I just think it's something to look forward to in the fashion space. In unison with technical / functional clothing and the desire to dress in a dystopian aesthetic, this creates cyberpunk fashion. And these cyberpunk movies and novels have given consumers and designers alike a glimpse into what the future may hold and how we should be dressing. Going back to XEONIQ's article, what I find really interesting about it is that he approaches this topic from a more holistic and objective perspective. He not only writes about the arguments in support of cyberpunk's influence on fashion and aesthetics, but he offers thorough counterpoints that are equally as valid. One of those opposing arguments he discussed was just because something is techwear does not equate to being cyberpunk, mentioning that sometimes people wear super expensive clothes which do not aid in like daily practicality or functionality and are just worn for an outfit picture to flex online. So I think reading that article after finishing this video will provide a more comprehensive and deeper view on the subject. I realize that I have largely been introduced to the cyberpunk genre through fashion, specifically techwear. I mean, sure, I knew about The Matrix and Blade Runner, but I didn't really spend that much time and I didn't look that deep into the genre until I got into this fashion style. I just saw what I thought was a really cool clothing style, and then I got more into cyberpunk media and then saw the connection between the two. So it wasn't like I was a huge cyberpunk fan which led me to be interested in clothes, it was the contrary. Both clothing and literature are extremely subjective things. Literature can, and I think is supposed to be interpreted differently by everyone. And the same goes for fashion as well. One of my great appeals to fashion is the diversity of expression through clothing. So when you take these two concepts, literature and fashion, and you try and make a connection between them, there's a lot of wiggle room, let's just say that. But this is just my perspective on these two subjective ideas, but I would love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments. I do read them all, and I'm actually very interested to hear your take on this subject. I also just want to thank XEONIQ for working with me on this video. Like I said earlier, his expertise on cyberpunk and technical clothing is very impressive, so I recommend reading his article to gain a different perspective on the subject. I also strongly recommend watching all the movies that I've pulled clips from to illustrate my point and give a different perspective on these films, and I will link down below where you can rent or buy these films. I mean, there's some of my favorite films, and I encourage you all to go watch for yourselves. Any articles that I mentioned in this video, I will also link in the description below. But this video was a huge learning experience, and it took a lot of work. So if you like this video, if you wouldn't mind leaving a like, it would just really help me out. And I know this video was different to what I normally do, but I do like to explore other things in the fashion industry other than just doing reviews and styling videos. But anyways guys, thank you for stopping by, and I will see you in a video pretty soon, so see ya.